Good morning, everyone. My name is Ole Jakob Sending. It's a great pleasure to have this seminar today with Professor Iain Johnston from Harvard. I just wanted to say, one, this event is being streamed. Two, it forms part of our new Center on Geopolitics, which has its kickoff next week, so hope to see all of you there. And the center is financed by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs through the Research Council of Norway. And with that, I think I will hand it over to Hans-Jørgen, who will do a more proper introduction of our guest today. Thank you.
All right. Hi, everyone. And first, thank you, I think also Ole Jakob, for inviting Professor Alastair Iain Johnston to NUPI. And then, of course, secondly, and firstly, to Professor Johnston for saying yes to coming here and sharing updated, fresh takes on his very juicy, interesting research here with us today. And Johnston is, of course, one of the most known scholars out there when it comes to international politics, international relations, and China. And he is the Governor James Albert No and Linda No Lane Professor of China in World Affairs in the Government Department at Harvard University. And he has worked on a lot of different issues when it comes to China and Chinese foreign policy in particular, security politics and issues in the region, U.S. policy, of course, when it comes to dealing with China, and also, of course, public opinion and perceptions both in mainland China and in Taiwan. And I think it's fair to say that you've also known for going a bit beside kind of the mainstream when it comes to choosing theoretical or analytical lenses. So using a lot of social psychology and socialization theory in your work on understanding both how Chinese politics and world affairs dealing with the US and other countries evolved. Here today, you're here to talk about identity, race, and the US-China security dilemma. A very hot, I would say, hot topic issue and timely. I think I would also like to point out, before I give the floor to you, that the word race in a Norwegian and an English or American language setting has a bit of a different use and a bit of a different meaning. So those of you who have kind of read into how we announced the seminar, firstly in the Norwegian context, might have questioned how we use the word race there. And if anyone have questioned that, that's because of me. I did not pay enough attention to the this kind of different distinction between the use of those words in an English and Norwegian setting. And I mentioned that, of course, because Iain is here today speaking in English about his research in English, whilst a lot of you here are, of course, Norwegian. So please pay attention to that. It's the English kind of use of the term we, of course, speak about today and not the Norwegian one. Having said that, we're very much looking forward to your presentation. Professor Johnston will then speak for around 20-25 minutes first, followed by a conversation, and then we'll have a few minutes left for questions towards the end. And on that note, welcome, and so much looking forward to hearing your presentation.
Thanks very much, Hans. Appreciate it. Well, it's a real honor to have this chance to talk to you about some of the speculative ideas that I've been playing around with recently with a colleague of mine, D.G. Kim. As a Canadian, coming to Oslo feels very comfortable. I had no problem walking across from the hotel without wearing a scarf or mitts. It just seemed very natural. Plus, the welcome was very warm, too, so I appreciate it. So just before I start, if I use when I use the term Americans or Chinese or China and the United States, unless otherwise specified, it's shorthand for leaders, not for people. So Despite their political differences, the United States and Chinese leaders share a similar explanation for their rivalry. Self, referred to self as the in-group, self is uniquely benign, more or less upholding the normatively appropriate distributions of power, territory, and norms. Other is uniquely malign and challenging the normatively appropriate distribution of power, territory, and norms. Both are certain that these assessments are correct. In the United States, there is a general agreement that China is fundamentally a revisionist state determined to undermine the U.S. rules-based order. On the PRC side, the orthodoxy is that the United States is a fundamentally hegemonistic country that has consistently threatened the Communist Party's legitimacy and security. I think both these characterizations are or are not very accurate, or are inaccurate. First, as I've written before, contrary to U.S. claims, there is no singular U.S.-led rules-based order to be overthrown. I would argue that I speculate that there are multiple orders in different domains with different norms, and China approaches these different orders differently. China strongly supports the sovereignty-enhancing UN-based order that constitutes the current territorial state-based international system. It strongly opposes the current sovereignty-diminishing liberal political rights order, and it moderately abides by the sovereignty-limiting free-ish trade order. And contrary to Beijing's claims, after the 1970s, the United States has not been trying to undermine Communist Party rule. There have been no strategy documents, no policy guidance about how to prevent China's rise or how to undermine the Communist Party rule. So it would seem to be that the U.S.-China rivalry is being driven in part by inaccurate certainty about the other's intentions. So the question is, where does inaccurate certainty come from? I hypothesize it comes from beliefs about identity. The traits and characteristics people believe that they have as being members of an in-group. The most certain and usually the most inaccurate belief that people have about their own group's intentions, and therefore the intentions of the other group, are about self's exceptional virtuousness and others' exceptional non-virtuousness. And I think there are three clusters of theory that tell us why this happens in international politics. One cluster of theory is called social identity theory. It basically tells us that people in groups want to maximize their self-esteem as members of a valued in-group. Groups do this essentially by contrasting self's sense of its own benign exceptionalism with a view of other as being exceptionally malign. A second body of literature is introspection illusion, work on introspection illusion. And the argument here is that self uses introspective information, in other words, information about their thoughts and their feelings and their motives, to assess the intention behind their own behavior. And the conclusion usually is that their own behavior is, their intentions are benign. But they tend to use others' behavior rather than introspective information about the other's feelings and motives to assess the intentions behind others' actions. And the conclusion usually is that the intentions of the other's actions are malign. And then there's literature on dehumanization and what's known as infrahumanization. So when self believes in its benign exceptionalism, it tends to characterize the other group as lacking a complete range of complex human traits. This can be done through dehumanization, which basically means characterizing the other in non-human terms, describing them as animals, for example, or as objects. And this is typically what conventional racism, how conventional racism is often expressed. Or it can be done by infrahumanization, which refers to stereotyping others as having only a limited range of human characteristics. So this is all theory. What about evidence that identity differences in the US-China relationship are helping to generate inaccurate certainty about others' intentions. One example is the US-China, the competing discourses about order. These discourses are not just descriptions of a desired international order. They also embody claims about identity about self and identity about the other. For example, the US discourse about a US-led rules-based order embodies the following identity claims. The rules-based order constitutes the United States as a status quo state, and the status quo state has brought peace and prosperity globally since 1945, and it therefore constitutes China as a revisionist state challenging the rules-based order. Status quo states are virtuous. They uphold norms and institutions. They play by the rules of the game. They are responsible. Revisionist states, on the other hand, are therefore challengers to rules. They're cheaters. They're irresponsible. In Tony Blinken's words, they bring chaos to order. In other words, the rules-based order discourse embodies a belief in the benignness of U.S. identity and versus the maligness of China's identity. Now, China has articulated its own vision of order. It's called the Community of Common Destiny. One's translation is the Community of Common Destiny. The Community of Common Destiny, if you look at the key documents that constitute it, is really an inconsistent mix. It includes Westphalian sovereignty centrism. It includes ideas of liberal economic interdependence. It includes Western ideas about comprehensive, common, and cooperative security. In that respect, there's nothing particularly new or original or consistent in the way the Community of Common Destiny has been conceptualized. But crucially, the Community of Common Destiny idea also embeds an identity claim about self and other. Chinese leaders claim that the core of the Community of Common Destiny reflects the Chinese nation's inherently peaceful or peace-loving history and culture, summarized by an increasingly popular term these days, Chinese peace genes. 和平的基因. This is a quote from Xi Jinping where he says, "The Chinese nation's blood does not have the genes for invading others or for seeking global hegemony." This is an identity statement, obviously, and it contrasts China's or Chinese identity, the Chinese ethnicity's identity, because the term he uses is the term for ethnicity, minzu. Chinese ethnicity's benign exceptionalism is contrasted implicitly with America's malign exceptionalism. The term hegemonism is a code word for the United States. But like the US concept of a rules-based order, the claim of China's or Chinese ethno-cultural peaceful exceptionalism isn't historically accurate. The idea that China is uniquely historically peaceful domestically or internationally is not upheld by the empirical evidence. But the term peace genes is increasingly used in Chinese discourse, as you can see, particularly beginning after 2014. There's been a particularly rapid increase in the appearance of the term peace genes in Chinese academic journals and media publications. These two competing visions of order are both very certain and very inaccurate, that self is exceptionally benign and other is exceptionally malign. Now, the most highly certain and highly inaccurate identity claims that groups can make are racial stereotypes about self's superiority and others' inferiority. Of course, the science is clear. These claims about the superiority, inferiority of genetic or ethnic cultural traits are wrong. There's no scientific evidence for this. These are social constructs. But nonetheless, when people invoke racial stereotyping, they are, in a sense, making one of the most extremely inaccurate statements that one can make about self or other. And yet, this kind of stereotyping operates in politics and in international relations. Well, racism is understudied in international relations. The effect of racial beliefs or racialized stereotypes in international relations is understudied. This is changing. The international relations, at least it's changing in the United States. In the international relations field, it's rediscovered research that goes back to work by African American scholars in the pre-World War II period on how beliefs in racial hierarchies explain colonialism. This is the Howard School of International Relations research that came out of Howard University in the pre-World War II period. And the more contemporary international relations theory field is newer research is helping the focus on the impact of racialized beliefs on international relations is appearing in newer research in international relations in a range of topics, everything from explaining motivations for great power war to how alliances are designed, how so-called special relationships are developed. Work is showing how, for example, global patterns of immigration reflect racialized beliefs about immigrants. There's new research that focuses on how, in the United States at least, how racialized beliefs affect trade preferences. So there's no reason to believe that race and racism and racial resentment doesn't show up in the U.S.-China rivalry. Just to be clear, I am not claiming, underscore not, claiming that in the U.S.-China relationship, all hardliners have racist beliefs, but all people with racist beliefs are likely to be hardliners when it comes to how to handle intergroup relations. So how might identity difference generally and racialized stereotypes specifically affect the intensification of a rivalry between two countries? I just want to again issue a caveat. What follows is an exploration of the plausibility of the hypothesis that racism and racial stereotyping are influencing the U.S.-China security dilemma. It's not a rigorous test against alternative explanations. It's simply a plausibility probe of hypotheses that extend from the argument about the effect of racial stereotyping on rivalry. So typically, security dilemmas have 5 characteristics. The first is increasingly tight conflictual interactivity between the two sides. This is a given. It wouldn't be a rivalry without interactivity. And in the U.S.-China relationship, there's lots of evidence that shows an increasingly tight tit-for-tat interaction in the military, economic, and diplomatic activities aimed at responding to each other's actions. Lots of data about that. I won't talk about that. It's pretty self-evident. A second feature of a security dilemma, in addition to an increasingly tight interactivity, is the denial of this interactivity by actors on both sides. And here's where the idea of the introspection illusion matters. So self tends to believe that its behavior is a function of its conscious internal state, its benign values, and that other should see self's intentions as benign. As a result, if there is conflict and self sees itself as blameless, the escalation therefore must be entirely due to the obvious maligness of the other side. And indeed, we see discourses from both the United States and China that claim that the other side is inherently the source of instability in the relationship. In the last decade, for example, about 70 to 80% of US media articles that mention the rules-based order also note China as fundamentally challenging its features. So the concept, the salience of references to rules-based order is almost always linked to the salience of China's challenging the rules-based order. In the PRC, there's been a rapid growth since 2018 in the frequency of Chinese Communist Party media references to US hegemonism and to US containment of China. Now, there are 3 other features of rivalry that are related to inaccurate certainty, that conflict is not interactive. So the third feature of a security dilemma is dehumanization and infrahumanization of the other. In this regard, self will often use dehumanization or infrahumanization of the other as a way of confirming self's own benign exceptionalism by underscoring the malign exceptionalism of the other. And there are a number of examples in contemporary US-China policy discourse of dehumanization and infrahumanization. I'll just give you a few of the more common ones. In terms of infrahumanization, the one theme is, in much of the commentary in the United States, is that China is highly competent, or Chinese are highly competent, but dishonest and cunning. Trump has blamed the U.S. Trade deficit on the intelligence and cunning of the Chinese. Senator Marsha Blackburn has argued that, quote, China has a 5,000-year history of cheating and stealing. Some things will never change. It's a very essentialized statement. It's not a statement about the Communist Party being cheating and stealing. It's a statement about the Chinese going back 5,000 years of history. In terms of dehumanization, one example was a statement recently by the commander of Southern Command, General Lara Richardson, who referred to, quote, the tentacles of the PRC in our neighborhood. Now, this image of an octopus spreading its tentacles geographically around countries is a common meme used historically to describe a sinister, ambitious presence. As for Chinese discourse, this one other image. This is an image of an idyllic American campus. You see innocent American students reading books, lying on the grass, presumably engaged in their education, but then you see a sinister Chinese dragon wrapping itself around the ivy and the columns of this idyllic university. This is an image actually that was put out by the U.S. State Department's Information Office. As for Chinese discourse, the claim that Chinese people are peace-loving constitutes and is constituted by the claim that Americans are not peace-loving. And this is an example of infrahumanization. As for dehumanization in the PRC discourse about the United States or anti-American propaganda, this was a cartoon that was posted by the Chinese ambassador to France, where the U.S. is portrayed as death, bringing domestic violence to countries around the world. This is an image that appeared in the People's Daily system, news agency, where the United States is a devil bringing death and destruction. A fourth feature of a security dilemma is that identity difference is related or predicts to militarized preferences or coercive preferences for dealing with the outgroup. Identity difference helps generate coercive preferences for dealing with a threatening other in two ways. First, self's belief in its own benign exceptionalism predicts to beliefs about the other's malign exceptionalism, and therefore the other is a threat. Second, belief in one's own benign exceptionalism therefore predicts to a preference for militarized solutions for dealing with this threat from the other. I'll give you an example from survey data that I was involved in comes out of Beijing. So basically we ran these surveys of attitudes towards foreign affairs held by Chinese citizens living in Beijing, ran them over a number of years. One of the questions we asked people was, where would you put on a scale from 1 peaceful to 7 warlike, where would you put Chinese people on this scale? Where would you put American people on this scale? And where would you put Japanese people on this scale? In the 2025 survey, the most recent one we did, 55% of respondents put Chinese people at the most peaceful end of this scale. So Chinese people are, overwhelmingly, the respondents believe that Chinese people are inherently peaceful. Interestingly enough, people who believe that Americans are very warlike are 4 times more likely to be people who come from this group who believe that Chinese people are inherently peaceful. In other words, if you believe that Chinese people are inherently peaceful, you are far more likely to believe that Americans are actually down at this end of the scale, and the Japanese are down at that scale. In addition, people who support increasing military spending were 2 times more likely to be people in this category of the scale where they believe that Chinese people are inherently peaceful, compared to people who were elsewhere on the scale. In other words, if you believe that the Chinese people were inherently peaceful, you are also much more likely to support increasing military spending. And this is entirely consistent with social identity theory, entirely consistent with the notion that your sense of your own benign identity leads you to believe that those with malign identities are inherently threatening. In the United States, a similar relationship between strong beliefs in U.S. Exceptionalism and hawkish preferences show up in attitudes of the Tea Party members in surveys that I was involved in the early 2010s. It was very clear that Tea Party members, who were precursors to the white nationalist Make America Great Again movement, were strongest believers in American exceptionalism, and they had the most hawkish preferences towards the PRC. On the U.S. side, a number of recent findings, recent studies find that a high level of anti-Asian racial resentment predicts to a heightened perception of China as a threat. D.G. Kim, a colleague I'm working with on some of these projects, finds, for example, that racial resentment also predicts to greater support for militarized responses to the threat. Don't worry about this graph too much. All you need to know is that the x-axis is a measure of anti-Asian resentment. It's increasing as it goes to the right, and the y-axis is a measure of the probability of supporting the use of force against China. And the relationship clearly shows that the higher you rank on an anti-Asian resentment scale, the more likely you are to support the use of force against the PRC. On the China side, there is more media attention to U.S. anti-Chinese racism. This simply counts the frequency of articles that appear in Chinese newspapers across time, where the term United States and racism appear in the same sentence. And as you can see, there's a big jump beginning in 2021 into 2022 in the frequency of media references to American American racism in the Chinese media. Now, D.G. Kim, my colleague, shows in surveys that he has done in China, shows that when Chinese respondents in the PRC are exposed to reports, media reports about U.S. racial resentment directed towards Chinese and Asians, this has 3 effects. Exposure to these reports increases the strength of Chinese respondents' identification as Asians, increases their resentment towards whites, to white people, and increases support for hawkish responses to the United States. In other words, taken together, these data suggest that there is an emerging interactivity between American and Chinese perceptions of racialized identity differences and more coercive policy preferences. Now, a 5th feature of security dilemma is that the group engages in policing of the group to delegitimize criticisms of dominant narratives. Typically, when groups believe that they face security threats, they tend to police against internal critics, who are seen at best as inaccurate or naive, or at worst tools or agents of the other, of the outgroup. There's a Berkeley professor, Marika Landau-Wells, who argues that a particularly powerful way of policing the in-group is to invoke images of contamination. There are 2 types of contamination, images of contamination. One is figurative contamination and one is literal. So figurative contamination would invoke images of threats to the content, the cohesiveness, of the in-group's identity. So this might be ideological threats, or it might be heretics in a religious context, or it might be fifth columnists. So that's figurative contamination. Literal contamination invokes threats of disease, as was used historically in the United States in anti-Chinese immigration discourses in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. As for figurative identity contamination, there are three relevant facts here. First, there is polling which suggests that about a third of Americans believe Chinese Americans, so American citizens, are more loyal to the PRC than they are to the United States. Second, a large portion of the Republican Party in the United States today identifies with white nationalist, Make America Great Again movement. And third relevant fact, I think, is that there is a rising white nationalist influence in Congress, particularly members of Congress whose districts have fairly active white nationalist movements. So white nationalism is being mainstreamed in Congress, or in the Republican Party at least. So together, this all suggests that there is a substantial political base for racialized support for hardline policies towards China and for domestic monitoring of ethnic Chinese populations on insider threat grounds. Now, the PRC has, in the last few years, engaged in the blurring of the distinction between nationality, citizenship on the one hand, and ethnicity on the other. And it has become increasingly active in efforts to use overseas Chinese communities for national purposes, for the rejuvenation of the PRC. This ends up reinforcing the long-time racialized tropes in the United States about Chinese Americans' loyalty. So as you can see, in the last couple of years, there's been a big jump in references to China's sons and daughters, which is a term referring to Chinese people all over the world, and the goal of rejuvenation of the PRC. So basically, the discourse coming out of the PRC today is that Chinese people all over the world have an obligation or responsibility to help the rise of the PRC. That message to ethnic Chinese populations in other countries where they are citizens of other countries helps create this notion, this myth of the disloyalty of Chinese Americans or Chinese Australians or Chinese Canadians. So in essence, the Chinese discourse about mobilizing ethnic Chinese around the world for the assistance of China's growth places these citizens of other countries who happen to be ethnically Chinese in increasingly difficult political positions. As for biological contamination, that's a discussion of literal contamination. As for, that's a discussion of symbolic contamination. In terms of literal contamination, the notion of biological contamination and contamination of the in-group has come together with identity contamination during COVID in the United States in discourses that appealed to the MAGA movement and to white nationalists. So for example, Trump, during his election rallies in 2020, often used a racialized term for the pandemic. He called it the Kung flu. And if you watch the videos of him using this term, it's quite clear that gets the largest cheers, the largest rise out of the audience in his political rallies. There's more sophisticated research by Cao et al. In the National Bureau of Economic Research that has found that after Trump first tweeted a reference to the Chinese virus in mid-March, there was a big spike in Twitter hashtags and Twitter retweets of anti-Asian, anti-Chinese content, and there was also, that's the red line is the anti-Asian Twitter. The bars are anti-Asian harassment incidents of harassment as collected by various Asian lobbying groups. There was also then a spike in anti-Asian harassment right after he first tweeted Chinese virus. And the largest jump, the largest spike in these two phenomena occurred statistically in counties that supported Trump in the 2016 election, and they were not as significant in counties that supported Clinton in the 2016 election. In other words, Trump was tapping into a constituency in his geography of support that was responding positively to this invoking Chineseness connected to contamination. In China, some nationalist hawks have suggested that the white race, they use the term white race, generalization for the West, is a source of ideological threat. Ethnic Chinese in the PRC, who are seen to be the most threatening to in-group cohesion and security, are often referred to as Hanjian, which translates generally into the term race traitors. And biological contamination memes surfaced in 2020 in China when the foreign ministry spokesperson claimed that COVID it may have come to China from US military labs. So in conclusion, identity difference can turn extant conflicts of interest in particular issue areas into existential cross-domain and zero-sum threats. And when identity difference is racialized, rivalry is likely to be characterized by hyper-certainty about the malign intentions of the other, hyper-dehumanization of the other, and hyper-militarized responses. So what are the chances that racialized images of the other will intensify the US-China rivalry? And I want to be very, very careful here. I've only presented very preliminary evidence about the relationship running from claims about exceptionalism to increasing threat perception to militarized preferences to the intensification of rivalry. Not all of the links along this causal chain have been tested. We have evidence that links exceptionalism to threat perception and to militarized preferences. We don't know whether that will then in turn affect the intensification of the rivalry, in part by strengthening in-group exceptionalism as conflictual interactions continue. So let me pose my conclusion as a hypothesis. Given that the ruling party in China promotes the idea of ethno-racial exceptionalism, and given that one of the major political parties in the United States is increasingly dominated by white nationalists who believe in US ethno-racial exceptionalism, and who could hold the White House next year, we should expect inaccurate certainty about self and other to intensify, and therefore we should expect the security dilemma itself to intensify. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We're very happy to carry on with conversation. Sitting here, I assume, if we can get
Need some water.
we definitely should. You should definitely have some water.
Thank you.
All right. Wow, I would say it's thank you again so much for coming here to present, which I understand is new updates on research that you have been doing for some time, and that still might be in the process of continuation, timely and rich, and of course I think to quite a few a bit eye-opening in terms of how sharp and racially terms some of the discourses and claims in those discourses are being presented. I think I'll start out with addressing, a lot of us are very used to speaking about national identities, state identities, historical grounds. And as you say, start off with, there is very good reason to believe that perceptions towards race or racially kind of charged accusations or beliefs have been present, of course, in foreign policy debates throughout the times. So it's not necessarily a new phenomenon. How do you kind of feel or sense about addressing race, per se, so directly in a research topic in your academic circles, and of course here presenting it in a more kind of public setting?
So, as I tried to suggest, the discussion of beliefs about race, and I want to say beliefs because, as I said, I want to underscore that race is a socially constructed category. It does not exist scientifically, even though lots of people believe it does, particularly in the United States. I'm certainly not the first to think of this. There has been for a number of years now a small group of researchers who have increasingly focused on, for example, sort of rediscovered the Howard School of International Relations from the World War II period, and have revived a lot of the work done by some of the scholars at Howard University, many of whom were African American, whose starting point in analyzing international politics, and in those days the focus was primarily on colonialism and imperialism. Their starting point was that you can't understand European imperialism and colonialism without understanding the racial hierarchies that Europeans work with. And so the revived interest in the Howard School is focusing on this very early understanding that a lot of international relations may actually boil down to notions of immutable and ordinary hierarchies that are ultimately rooted in beliefs about race. That research kind of disappeared. There's a notion that it was ignored by international relations theory in the United States essentially from World War II on. And it's being revived. The interest in race is being revived by a number of scholars. And as I suggested, I sort of provided a list of some of the more recent research that has focused on, just to give you an example, racial perceptions and trade. This one study by 3 very mainstream, straight-up, typical American social scientists, quantitative analysts. They did a study that basically had people rank countries in terms of their darkness, from light to dark. And then they asked another group of respondents basically attitudes towards trading with these different countries that were ranked in terms of racial sort of standard racial stereotype differences. And what they found was that whites were much less likely to be willing to trade with countries that they considered were dark. And were much more likely to see the trade relationship in relative gains terms rather than absolute gains terms. So it's a kind of almost a zero-sum relationship. There is some really interesting research, for example, that showed that one of the reasons why the United States preferred setting up relatively simple bilateral relationships with allies in the Asia-Pacific region after the Second World War versus a very complex multilateral alliance in the transatlantic space after the Second World War. They found documents coming out of the State Department which suggested that the State Department felt that you could not have complicated, sophisticated multilateral alliances with people from, for example, the Philippines or other parts of Asia because they were not sophisticated enough compared to transatlantic world. So this kind of research is coming out of people who have suddenly discovered that there is this angle to the way both publics and decision makers understand the world, namely in racial and ethnic stereotypical terms, that actually helps us understand some of the phenomena that we've typically looked at through domestic politics arguments, for example, or through distribution of power arguments or international norm arguments. So I'm kind of tapping into that. I'm not at all a leader in that regard. I'm learning from other people.
As we all are. I'll try to unpack a bit. I think you gave a very well presented arguments around the types of actors and the time dimensions in terms of episodes or periods that are more or less intensified. But I wanted to elaborate a bit and intensify a bit. Could you repeat a bit, or maybe say a bit more about who the actors, the groups and the actors on both sides, both the US and the Chinese side, who actually actively and more or less thoughtfully use racially charged kind of ideas and terms to make arguments towards the foreign policy kind of stance towards both countries?
It's easier to identify those actors in the United States, and it's pretty clear that they are predominantly in the Republican Party, and they are predominantly come from what was originally the Tea Party and now is the Make America Great Again movement surrounding Trump. But there are deeper roots to that, and there's a literature, for example, in American politics that focuses on the strategy that the Republican Party basically picked up in the 1960s. Was called the Southern Strategy. It was basically, how do you win over disaffected white voting, which had historically been voting for the Democratic Party. And from Nixon through to Reagan, through to Trump, the question is, how do you mobilize white voters? And you mobilize white voters in part by playing up or using racially charged discourses about African Americans, for example. And so survey after survey, for example, shows that the MAGA supporters, the MAGA movement, for example, essentially white nationalists, believe that African Americans have a number of traits that makes them unwilling to work hard to try to catch up to what model minorities look like, that argues that they blame the structural racism on slavery, and that's illegitimate to do that. And these are the kinds of deeply held beliefs that component of the Republican Party hold to. Now, what proportion of the Republican Party? Some people suggest it's roughly 40%, perhaps. But ultimately, it sort of boils down to the signals that they're getting from their leader. And Trump routinely uses racialized stereotypes to characterize adversaries, or to link adversaries to denigrated minorities. So, for example, most recently, controversy over presidential documents and who has taken them where, and Trump stole a bunch of presidential documents and highly classified ones, and kept them in his palace in Florida. And then he accused Biden of also stealing presidential documents. And at one point he said Biden took all of these boxes of presidential documents and hid them in Chinatown in Washington, where he said, and in Chinatown where they don't even speak English, and this is illegal, and oh, by the way, Biden gets money from China. So in one short statement, he basically says Chinese Americans are not really Americans. They don't speak English. They're not assimilated. 2, they're engaged or hiding or allowing the hiding of illegal activity. And 3, illegal activity by somebody who works for or is essentially beholden to the PRC. That's the kind of signaling that Trump is sending out to the MAGA movement. On the Chinese side, it's, we don't know whether for example, the discourse about peace genes, how widely believed that is. That's a term that Xi Jinping in particular has pushed. So of course it's going to be repeated frequently in the Chinese system, given party discipline. I assume it's not literally a genetic claim, but it's a metaphoric claim about the immutability and the inherent peacefulness of the Chinese people that goes back well into history. There are presumably some people who genuinely believe this. As I said, our surveys show that at least in 2015, the majority of our respondents believed the Chinese people were inherently peaceful. And in previous years, that number was a little higher, sometimes a little lower, but it was relatively consistent. I assume that that's genuinely believed, at least at the mass level. Whether the mass level matters in terms of policy is a different question. At the elite level, you know, you often see arguments about, so the term that is used to describe the peace genes, as I briefly alluded to, that Xi Jinping used and that Chinese discourse uses, refers to the term minzu. And so the Chinese minzu, the Chinese people, it's a term that is used to describe nationality and ethnicity. So the Uyghurs are a minzu, the Tibetans are a minzu, the Han people are a minzu. But sometimes the usage blurs the distinction between ethnicity and race, 种族 in Chinese. So sometimes when people use, refer to the inherent peacefulness of the Chinese people, they root it in cultural traditions that are not the cultural traditions of other minorities, but are the cultural traditions of the alleged Han majority, which I think bleeds into an argument that these are so immutable that they might be seen as quintessential to the Han people. And that may be genuinely believed as well, but we just don't obviously have access to elites the way we do here. One more recent incident where there was a kind of a casual stereotyping of racial groups was when the PRC's foreign minister Wang Yi was meeting with the foreign minister of South Korea, I think, in Japan, and he basically said, Europeans are never going to consider you to be similar to them, no matter how yellow you make your hair or pointy you make your nose. And he basically said, we're Asian, know your roots. So he uses racial stereotyping to a critique of racial stereotyping to bolster this notion that there is a shared Asianness that means that we will never be accepted by the West. That kind of language is not that uncommon, I think, in the Chinese system. One final example, and I know I tend to run on with examples, but at this point, without systematic data, all I have are stories. There was the Chinese media puts on an annual New Year's show, the CCTV, the Chinese Central Television, puts on this annual New Year's show. It's hours long, full of skits, all designed to inculcate particular ideas that the regime wants to inculcate. But there was one skit that was basically praising China's aid to Africa. And they produced Chinese actors dressed in what in the United States would be known as blackface, dressed up as Africans, given exaggerated features of Africans, and then these Africans were being, obsequiously grateful to Chinese assistance for development. Caused an outrage in a lot of countries outside of China, but apparently did not occur to the Chinese propaganda system that this might be considered offensive and racist. So, as I said, absent any more systematic data on elite attitudes on racial or ethnic differences, we don't have much more to go on other than these kinds of anecdotes.
Is the word or the term that you referred to, that Xi Jinping himself has actively used peace genes, is that a term that we've seen before, or that's actually now kind of coined into speeches?
Well, the slides, I have to go back. It appeared from time to time prior to that.
Okay.
But not nearly the degree to which it appears now after Xi Jinping first used the term publicly in 2014. Um, and so it's, as I say, it's probably metaphorical. But by invoking the term genes, you're basically saying this is the essentialized us. And we have these genes, right? We don't have the genes for invasion and hegemony being the United States. So Americans don't have the genes for peacefulness, don't have this essentialized characteristic trait that we do as Chinese. But they have the characteristic of hegemonism and invasion. So whether it's metaphorical or whether it is literal, the effect is the same, which is to sharpen the perception of maligness of the United States compared to the benignness of the Chinese people.
You've already said a bit about you said quite a lot about the actors on the U.S. side who most actively use the types of strong identity or racially charged kind of conceptions towards China or the Chinese. I would assume that some of the hardliners that you refer to, and keeping in mind that not all hardliners use this type of language, but that quite a few of those hardliners who would have want a harsher, tougher policy towards the USA would also be the types of actors who would also want more support offered towards Taiwan. In Taiwan, a kind of self-sustained or independence issues, wouldn't that be kind of inconsistent or like unlogical dilemma in a way if you charge race into those types of conversations?
Yes, I mean, I think the vast majority of the discourse in the United States that talks about why the United States should have or does have closer ties to Taiwan, security ties, economic, cultural, et cetera, are not putting the argument about the China threat in racialized or ethnicized terms. It's, PRC is a threat to democracy in Taiwan. PRC is a threat to U.S. strategic assets in the Western Pacific. My guess is that if you were to ask people in the MAGA movement, for example, about the Taiwan issue, that you get sort of three responses to how, in a sense, to how to resolve that contradiction, right? One would be to say, well, the Taiwanese are not Chinese, and many Taiwanese say that they're not Chinese, right? So it would be say, well, they're not Chinese, so therefore they don't have these traits that we've identified with Chinese. Or they might respond the way that some white racists respond when when they're accused of being racist. They say, "Well, no, I actually have friends who are black, but they're not like the others, right?
Other types,
yeah. Right. They're my blacks. They're not the blacks that are out there who constitutes this other." And the third possibility is that some of the responses are just not that bright and haven't figured out that there is a contradiction. So for when Marsha Blackburn, the senator from Tennessee or Kentucky, says the 5,000 years of cheating, if she also believes that, or if she were asked and said, maybe there's some Chinese heritage in Taiwan, clearly that creates a problem for her intellectually. But I'm not sure she's thought through it. So,
all right. A kind of key point in your arguments, or pointing to the potential consequences of some of these debates, is the kind of not necessarily uncertainty, but as you label it, inaccurate certainty. Could you repeat a bit like the key distinction between those two concepts, and in terms of what types of issues or episodes or situations being uncertain or being inaccurately certain, or believing that you're certain, is particularly risky? Because you do speak about also in your title, the U.S. security dilemma. So obviously there are dilemmas here,
right,
which might be more acute in
Right.
terms of some issues and situations.
So I apologize ahead of time. Bear with me because, because this may get a little obscure. So original theory about the security dilemma is that under conditions of anarchy, right, so no overarching authority governing the relations between states, states are uncertain about other countries' intentions. But under conditions of uncertainty, the prudent, rational thing to do is to prepare for the possibility of conflict. So you arm, you ally, but you're fundamentally uncertain of what the other's intentions are. But the conservative thing to do is to prepare for the worst. The other side is the same. The other side is uncertain about your intentions and then engages in the same kinds of allying or arming or balancing behavior, and then you get this cycle of insecurity. The assumption is that those states are essentially status quo oriented. And if they were certain about each other's intentions, if they had accurate certainty about each other's intentions, then you wouldn't have the insecurity cycle, right? You'd figure out, okay, the other side is actually not a threat. So security dilemma is driven by, at least initially, traditional security dilemma theorizing is driven by this notion of uncertainty under conditions of anarchy, generating a insecurity spiral. I think that doesn't make a lot of sense, either empirically or theoretically. Empirically, it doesn't make a lot of sense because I think one can argue that fundamentally the U.S. and China are, in terms of whether or not they are existential threats to the other, are not. And therefore it's inaccurate to say that they are. And in that regard, there is a status quo-ness, at least at that level of intentions on both sides. But both sides are absolutely certain the other side is an existential threat. So that's an instance of inaccurate certainty, right? It's still a dilemma in the sense that if they had accurate certainty, then they would be able to back down from some of these cycles of insecurity. Now, what I think the advantage to some degree of thinking about security dilemmas in terms of inaccurate certainty is that it allows for understanding the effect of history on the security dilemma, right? The standard model of the security dilemma is kind of this very static notion that the start of a security dilemma, you are uncertain about the other side's intentions. At the end of the security dilemma, you're still uncertain, or eventually they're clarified. But if you think of security dilemmas as a socialization process where there is this constantly, increasingly malign and conflictual interaction, that's information that should bolster your inaccurate certainty about the other side's malign intentions. So what you should see, if you start from the premise of inaccurate certainty, it allows you to account for the intensification of a security dilemma as both sides increase their initial incorrect assessments of the other side's maligness get reinforced by this conflictual interaction. Now, the advantage, I think, theoretically of that is that it can explain how security dilemmas can evolve into genuine rivalries between revisionist states. Because at a certain point, if the security dilemma is intense enough and the inaccurate certainties are intense enough, both sides might start to think that, gee, maybe the institutions that I have supported and maybe the distribution of power that I'm okay with is actually to my disadvantage. So maybe I should start to challenge the other side's institutions and rules and norms and territory and other existential features. And at that point, if both sides engage in that process of maybe the system is in fact disadvantageous to me because of this increasingly intense rivalry, then you see states evolve from status quo into genuinely revisionist states. And then you have kind of Chimerian conflict between genuinely revisionist actors. And the interesting question is, how close are we to that transition point? If you think of, one can imagine that there would be arguments in the United States, increasingly if the view is that the PRC is an existential threat to the United States, both domestically and internationally. One could imagine arguments being made that maybe it's now in the United States' interests to undermine the CCP, to destabilize the PRC, to encourage ethnic separation. Basically a big kind of Afghanistan strategy, the way Afghanistan was used to basically bleed and undermine the Soviet Union. Are there strategies for fundamentally destabilizing and undermining the rule of the Communist Party? At that point, I think that would be evidence then that we've transitioned from a security dilemma into this kind of Mir-Shamirian rivalry between revisionist states. So going back to the original question, I think the advantage of thinking about security dilemmas as inaccurate certainties is it allows us to understand how security dilemmas can intensify and then transition into essentially conflicts between empires, conflicts between revisionist states.
All right. So if we take as a starting point the situation we're in today, and without asking you to do a lot of future predictions unless you want to, how do you expect the China-US relations to evolve in the next few years? And I'm of course saying that knowing there's lots of issues, lots of multifaceted kind of interconnected dilemmas, but still these countries interact and do engage and do from time to time seek out to have a more or less kind of direct dialogue at various levels. So what's your kind of overall assessments of what types of dynamics we should be seeing between these two major powers of the world in the next couple of years at least?
Well, I guess it partly depends on who will be the next president. I mean, there's not a lot of difference, I think, between the way the Trump administration and the Biden administration have characterized the PRC as a revisionist threat. The Trump administration actually used the term revisionist more frequently to characterize China in its documents than the Biden administration does. The Biden administration prefers rules-based order. China is a challenger to rules-based order, but in essence, it's the same description. China as a revisionist state. I can't imagine that changing whether there's a Biden administration or a Trump administration. I am reluctant to predict the future because the best way, the most likely thing that's going to happen tomorrow is what happened today until it doesn't, right? So, so I eschew prognostication. But I think getting back to this question of a security dilemma, inaccurate certainties versus uncertainty, the disadvantage of a security dilemma based on inaccurate certainty is that it's very hard for one side to decide to try to signal self-restraint. If you think of how the US-Soviet security dilemma dampened in the mid-'80s and late '80s, it was partly a function of both Gorbachev and Reagan coming to the conclusion for different reasons that the other side may be more status quo oriented than we thought. Gorbachev, I think, came to that conclusion in part through the advisors who were around him, who argued that it would be worth testing that assumption, for example, by engaging in certain exercises of unilateral restraint, stopping nuclear testing, for example, withdrawing certain forces from the Central Front, to see whether there's a response. And if you did get a positive response, that would be evidence that this is a security dilemma. Reagan came to that conclusion as a result of this worldwide nuclear exercise that called Able Archer that was conducted in '83. The Soviets for a while thought this was actually leading to, was building up into a nuclear first strike against the Soviet Union, and there was real fear in the Soviet Union, that was the U.S. intent was to, in fact, destroy the Soviet Union in the first strike. Eventually, the Soviets were convinced that wasn't going to happen. When Reagan was given the after-action report about the Soviet response, he was astonished that the Soviets could possibly have thought that the United States would engage in that kind of behavior. And his conclusion was not, well, that's their problem for being so stupid or for misinterpreting the evidence. His response, in essence, was, that's our problem if that's how they react. And so that opened the door for Reagan to start exploring the idea of unilateral or proposals for arms control. If inaccurate certainty is rooted in concepts of identity difference or concepts of racialized identity difference, then the likelihood of you interpreting, first of all, likelihood of you engaging in tests of self-restraint are going to be much, much lower, right? Because you believe the essence of the other side is the only thing that restrains it is force or coercion. So unilaterally demonstrating self-restraint is going to be exploited by the other side. So there's no incentive to engage in unilateral self-restraint because of the nature of the other side. So a secure dilemma that is generated by inaccurate certainty is going to be much less susceptible. It's going to be much more difficult to slow down the secure dilemma precisely because demonstrations of unilateral restraint that are reciprocated, the probability of those are going to be much, much lower given the way you have attributed the entire conflict to the essential characteristics of the other side. So unless Xi Jinping and Biden or Xi Jinping and Trump have their come to Jesus moment and realize that maybe we're in a security dilemma and we need to exercise self-restraint to see whether we get reciprocated self-restraint. Unless that happens, then no, I would not be optimistic about the slowing down of the U.S.-China security dilemma.
All right. On that non-optimistic note, I'll say that I have lots of more questions I would love to ask, as I always do when I meet extremely knowledgeable and interesting, exciting people. But I also want to give the opportunity to people who actually come here and not only sit in their offices and in their homes and watching this streamed digitally. So we do have a few minutes for questions. Not necessarily too happy about long comments, but questions.
Well, it's only fair after I've taken up so much of your time.
You are definitely invited here to do take up our time, so that's not a problem. There's a question in the back, and Charlotte will try to run around with mics. And of course, everybody knows that this event is being streamed, so it's not only in the room.
Thank you for an interesting approach to the China-US relationships. But I'm a little bit questioning, why do you use race instead of nationality? Because, I mean, race tends to be yellow, white, black, etc. And as you said, with the example of South Korea, China tried to include them in their orbit. They don't like that. And you have Japan. Is it because Japan just quite simply accepts US leadership and never questions it at all, and thus they are not considered in it? So that's why I'm not sure I think I understand the race as compared to ethno-nationalism, which you have in several other countries. Because, I mean, race, you have the Ukraine-Russia conflict, you now have the Palestinian-Israel conflict exploding again, which of course is very close in race terms, in my opinion, as a Hamitic-Semitic group of people in the Middle East. So, thank you.
So I want to be very clear. I don't believe that race is a useful, ontologically or epistemologically useful term, because there's no scientific evidence that there's this thing called race. But the fact of the matter is, a lot of people nonetheless believe it to be true. And particularly in the United States, I can't talk about other countries. I don't know about other countries. We know that race is socially constructed. So there were periods in American history when people who would be from European ethnicities would vary in terms of the degree which they were considered to be white. So the categorization of races has changed historically because, as I said, it's socially constructed. In the United States, however, there is a significant portion of the population, as I said, today at least associated with the MAGA movement, who genuinely believe these categories matter and believe that there are inherent traits to African Americans, inherent traits to Chinese Americans or Chinese ethnic group. And these traits are seen as different. So MAGA supporters, for example, as I said, believe essentially that African Americans are not taking responsibility for their own conditions. Why? Because the MAGA movement denies the existence of structural racism. Why? Because structural racism implies that much of the driver in American history was slavery. And that is an affront to their claims about the origin story of the United States as founded by God and embodying questions of, concepts of freedom and liberty. The MAGA folks, I think, also, though, have characterized Chinese Americans or Chinese as different from whites as well, but different in a different way. Sometimes they see them as a, quote, model minority. In other words, Asian Americans have succeeded in education, have succeeded in terms of standards of living, et cetera, but they are unassimilated, that they are still more, as I said, roughly 30% of Americans believe that they are still more loyal to the PRC or to China. So they are model minorities, but they're unassimilated. And they have certain traits, as some of the more racialized comments about Asian Americans have indicated, like cunning, like sort of automaton-like ability to do things, that actually imply that as a threat, China is an incredibly competent threat because they have all of these positive characteristics. And my colleague, D.G. Kim, also ran surveys where he tested people on an anti-Asian resentment scale and on a model minority scale. To what degree do you believe Asians are model minorities? And it turns out that people who believe that Asians are model minorities actually also have a higher threat perception of China because this is a really competent threat. So to the extent that these beliefs exist, we can observe them, we can measure them. It suggests that to understand their policy implications, we will have to use, or we will use the categories that they think about, namely race. But again, I just want to underscore, I personally do not believe that it is an analytically useful category because it does not exist scientifically.
Julia?
Thank you, and thank you very much for your talk. I work on Russian politics and have been studying Russia-West relations from the prism of an evolving securitization dilemma for quite a few years. But of course, that perspective is now totally debunked because it's all about Russian imperialism. But I think your explanation is very important to hang on to because it still does explain something. So I have one short question as for the theory. What about the literature on the securitization dilemma? Because somehow the securitization instead of security captures the dynamic process which you're studying that is evolving identifications. So have you looked into that literature, building on Jennifer Mitzen and other sociologists? And then secondly, a more empirical question, because we are in Europe, because the narrative on Russia as a threat to the rules-based order has really caught on in Europe, and understandably so, because we have a war in Europe. But I'm wondering, what are your impressions? Will, you know, the narrative on China as a similar threat, what is the possibility for it to find a real resonance in Europe? I mean, for the time being, it is emerging and it is repeated, for example, amongst our government. But any reflections on that? Does it matter? Does it matter that the discursive terrain in Europe is very different from in the US as to, you know, how are we going to talk about China here in the coming years?
Great questions. Have you got a couple hours and we can...
Some of us do.
I'm not going anywhere until tomorrow, so I'm perfectly happy. So, first of all, Jennifer Mitzen's work is terrific. And in fact, she and Randy Schweller are the first to kind of really identify the notion that we call inaccurate certainty. But they were basically saying, look, security dilemmas as they evolve are actually evolve into beliefs about certainty about the malign nature of the other side. So freely acknowledge that they were the first, I think, to really recharacterize the nature of a security dilemma. And what we're trying to do is look for the social psychological basis for that recharacterization. So absolutely, Mitzen's work is important there. In terms of securitization dilemma, I think this is relevant in two ways. One is inaccurate certainty about the identity of the other, where you are maximizing the difference between self and other, predicts to certainly securitization of foreign policy, because the implication is that, first of all, the other is the source of the threat and the source of conflict. Therefore, you have to deal with that using coercive measures. And just to give you an example of that argument framed in ways that I think we would understand from our social psychological perspective. I was once in a meeting where a fairly senior U.S. military officer said that, of course, the Chinese only understand force. And then another officer right next to him said, yes, zebras don't change their stripes. So the first statement, they only understand force, I would call infrahumanization, right? Well, yes, some people only understand force, but a lot of people understand reciprocal self-restraint. The second statement, zebras don't change their stripes, I would characterize as dehumanization, where the essentialized nature of the Chinese is that they're not going to change, that they only understand force. Similar in nature to Senator Blackburn's comment about the Chinese for 5,000 years have been cheating and stealing. So I do think that our argument predicts to a more securitized external policies towards the other. The securitization of internal policies, I think, comes from the requirement for policing, as I mentioned at the last point, that in-groups are particularly sensitive to threats to their perceptions of their own benign identities. Where do those threats come from? Well, they do come from external sources, obviously. But in some senses, the worst threats are coming from internal sources, right? So if you think of, religions, who are religions most likely to go after with horrendous figurative and literal violence? It's heretics. It's not necessarily people from another religion. It's people who are abandoning the in-group or threatening the coherence or cohesion of the in-group. So that requires internal policing. So the big question mark, and again, this is a question mark, is whether some of this identity difference arguments about the China threat to the United States internally will lead to arguments about the need to monitor ethnic Chinese populations, to limit jobs that are sensitive national security jobs, limit access to technology that may be sensitive national security technology on a preemptive basis that they might be disloyal. Those kinds of sentiments started popping up amongst some groups in the late 90s in the wake of a case of actually an ethnic Taiwanese scientist in the U.S. nuclear weapons labs who was alleged to have transferred sensitive nuclear data to the PRC. There were calls by some for the possibility of needing loyalty oaths for people of ethnic Chinese heritage. It's possible, one could imagine, that people, ethnic Chinese applying for national security sensitive jobs, that the security clearance might be slow rolled so that the job never appears. Again, this is entirely speculation, but that would be the logical implication of policing of the in-group. And on the basis of concerns about ethnicity. There was one example, again, of the impulse of this kind of securitization system. Is a few years ago, the Department of Commerce, I think it was, drafted some regulations for deemed exports, so control over the exports of knowledge leaving the United States, which would mean controlling who could go into work in certain labs, work with certain technologies. And they drew up a list of sensitive countries where the people from these countries, should not be allowed to work in certain labs with certain technologies and universities because this might lead to the outflow of sensitive technology. The initial rules to determine who should or should not have access to these sensitive labs and technologies were based on where people were born, not where they've been raised, not what their citizenship was. So a literal reading meant that Chinese baby girls who had been adopted by Americans, grew up in the United States as American citizens, would be deemed as people from a sensitive country and would come under these rules. And universities were outraged, and to his credit, our president of our university at the time wrote a blistering critique of that kind of argument. But that's the impulse that emerges under securitization when you're deciding that peoples are a potential threat. In terms of the question about European tradition, I don't know enough about Europe and how the question of racial stereotyping plays in European politics or in foreign policy. I think what you raise, though, is an important question, which is, does identity difference based on ethnicity claims, is that, in a sense, less likely to lead to high levels of securitization compared to racially based perceptions of identity difference? If, for example, you have two ethnicities, some European countries that claim to have claim to have different ethnicities, but would be technically white in the United States context, but say are different in religion. You could imagine, okay, the identity difference is going to be focused on the religious differences, and then the question is, okay, how much are those religious differences? They become sources of threat perception or sources of support for coercion. It seems to me that kind of a conflict can at least be resolved through conversion, right? Forced or not forced, but religious conversion would solve that problem, that conflict. If the identity difference is based on immutable racial differences, you cannot solve that problem because you would believe that there's no way that somebody from a different race can change race, right? So the hypothesis would be, I think, that security dilemmas based on perceptions of ethnic difference should be technically easier to resolve than security dilemmas based on perceptions of racial difference. But again, I can't speak to the European case.
There are so many more issues and questions that I know people here would love to ask, not least also how we in our own research, in our institutions, in our own kind of academic environments also deal with security requirements and expectations. And I know that there are several more people on my list of people wanting to ask questions, but I also want to respect the time that we have set. So sadly, very good questions, but also quite elaborate answers. And I think that speaks to the type of topic and theme that we are dealing with, that it's not necessarily so easy to deal with in sharp and snappy ways. So thank you so much for coming here again, sharing generously of your time and your knowledge. And to Ole Jakob again for making this possible. And at least from myself, and I know that amongst colleagues and lots of people here, we would love to have you back and keep engaging around these issues, which are not going away, whether you are optimistic or not. So thank you so much for coming here, and thank you so much, everyone who took the time to be with us.
Thanks so much. Thank you.
We love to clap.
Thanks so much for the really terrific questions. I mean, as I say, this is a project that is in its early stages, so these are all very useful feedback. And absolutely, totally happy to come back as long as I'm not paying for it.
All right.
Because I have no money.